Section 16 of Settlers of the Marsh by Frederick Philip Grove. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bruce Pirie. Chapter 5a. Bobby. Again there were drives, for Niels started work in the bush right after plowing. As always, when he was driving, there was time to think, to brood. At the very first, when his wife's revelations had hit him like so many hammer blows, he had been stunned. Then, in life's first reaction against injury and death, he had been subject to sudden fits of rage, sudden wellings up in him of primeval impulses, of the desire to kill, to crush. At such moments he had indulged in horrible imaginings. He had felt as if he could have looked on while the woman perished under frightful tortures, as if he could have laughed at her contortions, as if he could have reveled in her agony. But those had been no more than impulses, comparable to brief eruptions of a volcano, which yet show what is hidden underneath. He had kept away from his house when his wife was about, entering it only in the early morning and at night. He and Bobby were batching it in the shack, living as once they had lived together in the house. Meanwhile, they had worked at what had to be done. They dug potatoes, replaced rotting fence posts, squared logs for a smokehouse and a larger granary. They went together into the bush. Niels was watching his house. It never occurred to him yet not to blame his wife for doing what it was her nature to do, not to judge her and to find her guilty. But as soon as the driving started, he went to work, unconsciously, at finding a new path through the tangled labyrinth of his life. What was the problem? He came to see that the real problem was very complicated. Judging her guilty, he demanded repentance and atonement, but he could not demand anything of her because she did not acknowledge his right to demand. He had no authority over her. She was planning revenge. Revenge for what? No doubt for a wrong she thought had been done her. Had he, Niels, wronged the woman, intentionally or not? That was the great question. She was right in reproaching him with weakness. He had fallen. But once he had fallen, could he have acted otherwise than he had done? Could he have simulated feelings which he did not have? The whole marriage, the whole antecedents of this marriage were immoral. So it all came back to this, that he should not have fallen. But suppose a man had fallen, what was he to do? Suppose he had simulated feelings which he did not have. Suppose, unlikely as such an outcome must be, he had succeeded in deceiving the woman into the belief that he really loved her. He would have had to bear the burden of that deceit to his grave. Could he have stood up under such a strain? He could not. His marriage would have been worse than concubinage. It would have been prostitution on his part. What had his resolutions amounted to, his good intentions of a year ago? To this, that he had intended to buy her off. He had strongly, forcibly realized that he was not the only sufferer. But he had not been willing, because he had been unable, to give her what she wanted, what she was looking for in him. He had been willing, instead, to give her money to go to the city with, provided she remained faithful to him. He had been fool enough not to see, as he saw it now, that no man can afford to let his wife go anywhere alone unless he can trust her. And of course he can trust her only if he knows that she can trust him in everything, absolutely. He can trust her only if not only she loves him, but if he loves her, and if she knows it, of positive knowledge. To make the best of a bad bargain? What folly! He saw clearly now that nobody in this relationship of marriage can ever make the best of a bad bargain. It is all or nothing. Give all and take all. If you cannot do that, stand back and refrain. But then he had not refrained. He had taken her. No matter where he turned in his agony, he saw no help for it. He saw no way out. Once more, when this utter hopelessness of the situation became clear to him, he hardened his heart. He could not help himself. He was he. He could not act or speak except according to laws inherent in him. What must happen would happen. He had sinned. He saw no atonement, none nowhere. And what about his life? What was its justification? No justification existed, except perhaps, in helping others. On one of his first drives to town, he met the ox team of the new German settler, Dahlbeck by name. On the wagon truck, drawn by the slow, plodding beasts, rested a sandbox without a seat. The man sat on the edge of the box, his feet dangling between the wheels. In front, on a little pile of straw, reposed a woman. The back of the low box was piled with bundles holding her belongings. It was the big strapping girl of the first farm to town, the one that had once looked at him when she had stood at the pump. She was lying down as the two teams approached each other, but she sat up as Niels drew near. Somehow at his sight a change took place in her expression. She recognized him. Her nonchalance dropped, and though she remained sitting, she seemed to rock herself on her hips. A provoking, challenging quality crept into the open smile with which she stared at him. The man's stern face, narrow, hatchet-shaped, also underwent a change, discernible in shadings only. In that change there was betrayed a feeling of restraint, almost of shame. It looked as if he would have liked to interfere, to call the woman to order, as if he felt embarrassed at his own failure to do so. His nod, in answer to Niels's, was almost forbidding. Niels liked the man for that nod. He read his mind in it. This man was a slave of passion. He would have preferred freedom, but he was a slave. The woman dominated, swayed, attracted, repelled him as she pleased. The woman was his evil genius. All that Niels read in a glance and a nod. Slowly, a new development traced itself out in the White Range Line house. It was not often that Niels even saw his wife in the early part of the winter. Still more than before, Mrs. Lindstedt led an indoor life. It seemed she never left the house any more. Niels provided for everything she might possibly need to carry on a purely animal existence. He saw to it that there was bread. Mrs. Schulze baked it. He gathered the eggs and skimmed the milk. He watched the flour bag, the potatoes, the smoked meat. He carried wood and water in. All this he did either before daybreak or after nightfall. He knew that upstairs, in that room on the east side of the house, there lay or sat a woman, his wife, spinning off her hours, her days, her weeks. For a long time he did not even hear her. The only signs of her life consisted in the slow dwindling of the supply of flour, in the disappearance of an egg or two a day from the colander on the kitchen shelf, in the fact that at night there was a little less water in the pail on the bench by the door. Only once or twice, very rarely, there was a light burning in the room upstairs, in the morning or at night. It would almost seem as if she watched for his appearance on the yard to extinguish even her lamp. The only intercourse between the two, and that an indirect intercourse, consisted in this, that once a week he took her mail, which continued to arrive with great regularity, and deposited it on the deal table in the hall whenever Bobby brought it from the office. When he looked for it the next time, as he never failed to do, it was gone. Whether she answered any of the letters or not, and if so, how, Niels did not learn. Then, shortly before Christmas, a chance meeting came about in the kitchen. Niels entered, rather later in the evening than usual, carrying a pail of milk to take it down into the cellar. It was quite dark inside and outside, yet Niels knew that he had left the lamp burning on the table. Perhaps when he went out the draught had extinguished it. He set his pail down by the door and felt for matches. As he did so, his hand touched the hot glass of the lamp. A gasp escaped him, and at the same moment there was the swish of clothes quite nearby, as of somebody running. Then the crash of a falling chair, and a half-suppressed cry. He found the matches, removed, still in the dark, the chimney from the burner, struck his match, and lighted the lamp. As he turned, he saw his wife in the corner behind the door. Apparently she had come down, thinking that he had finished the evening chores and had left the light burning by mistake. When she had heard him approaching over the crunching snow, she had blown the lamp and tried to escape without being seen. In the dark she had missed the door. He looked at her, and she, with a defiant toss of her head, gathered her wraps, which had half fallen about her, and fled. He heard her passing through the dining-room into the hall and up the stairs. It was a meeting of no more than a quarter minute. But in those few seconds Niels had seen a number of things. She had been in her nightgown, with a dressing-gown thrown over her shoulders. The dressing-gown was of light blue silk, the nightgown of pink organdie or some other light filmy material, profusely adorned with lace. But the face! For the fraction of a second he had thought it was the face of a perfect stranger. It had been that of an aging woman, yellow, lined with sharp wrinkles and black hollows under the eyes, the lips pale like the face. She had been without her makeup. After Christmas, one day, while he was attending to his chores, a second meeting took place. This time, the mere fact of the meeting was hard to explain. The first time it had been accidental. This time there could be no doubt but that it was intentional. Since their first encounter, Niels had made it a point to give ample warning of his presence whenever he entered the house. On this particular night he had gone down into the cellar, carrying the kitchen lamp and rattling the tin pails, which he had previously scalded in the kitchen. He was dipping the cream off the morning's milk when she, too, came down, carrying her own lamp in one hand and a little dish in the other. She took no notice of him, but passed him by as if he did not exist. Again she was in undress for the night, with a gown thrown over her shoulders. Again her face, that of an aging woman, aged by God knew what, stood in strange contrast, an incomprehensible, almost uncanny contrast to her appearance. It was so yellow, lined. Neither said a word. When she returned upstairs, Niels finished his work in the cellar, feeling guilty, downcast, despondent. He took the skimmed milk to the kitchen to leave it there, ready for the morning when it would be fed to the pigs. Then he went out to bring in a few armfuls of wood for the heater in the dining-room. He noticed, before he went out, that there was a light in that room. Yet he never thought anything but that she, knowing he would come back, had simply left the lamp burning when she went upstairs. As soon, however, as, in returning, he opened the door, he saw her standing by the stove, her dressing gown thrown back, warming herself in the heat that radiated through the mica panes of the feed door. For a moment he hesitated, looking at her. Then she spoke. "Just put the wood down," she said, perfectly cool. "I'll see to the fire." Her voice was that of a person speaking to a servant whose presence is in no way considered as embarrassing or as imposing restraint. Yet she stood there as no woman could show herself to any man but her husband. Henceforth the same thing happened often. Soon it became the regular thing. Whenever Niels entered the house, at least at night, for it could not be but that she watched for the time when he would come. Never before had she been downstairs with such regularity, not even in the first few months of their marriage. She went about as if either everything were perfectly harmonious between them, and they perfectly secure from the intrusion of any stranger, or as if he did not exist, as if he were a being of air, a spirit ministering and bound to minister to her wants. Niels did not know how to take it, what to think or to do. Sometimes he waited till a later hour before attending to his chores in the house. It did not make any difference. Once he waited till midnight. That time, when he entered through the kitchen door, the milk was frozen solid, the whole house was dark. But when he returned from the cellar, the dining room was lighted by the big floor lamp, and there, by the stove, stood his wife. He could not doubt any longer. There was a purpose behind her conduct. What was that purpose? He could not see his way through her psychology. He had no means of reading the mind of a woman driven to extremes. It never occurred to him that this was a last attempt on her part to bring about a reconciliation. She displayed herself to him, but to save her pride, she made it hard for him to find her attractive. Had he made a single motion towards her, had he said a single word, even though it had been a word of forgiveness instead of desire, perhaps the worst might still have been averted. Fate might have been stayed. In him, however, all sexual instincts were dead. The work in the bush went on. Day after day there was time to ponder, to brood. Matters were getting on Niels's nerves. He employed quite a crew in the bush now. He was being watched. He was the boss. Harder and harder did he drive himself. His hands took it that he was setting an example for them. Naturally, he wanted to make money. When he told them to take their time, all but Bobby saw in that mere hypocrisy. Niels drove, as he had always done, the old Percheron team, Jock and Nellie. There was another such team on the farm now, bred and raised there. Once he had been considerate in the highest degree wherever these two horses were concerned. That was no longer the case. Once, not so long ago, he had never neglected to pat them when he fed them in the stable. Now he roughly shouldered them aside when he entered their stalls. When Jock, as of old in the beginning of the winter, had once or twice turned his head to scrape his master's hand with his teeth, Niels had, with an impatient movement, declined his familiarity. Horses know, as well as dogs, whether their masters feel friendly towards them or not. Unlike dogs, they do not cling to or fawn upon him who does not deserve their love. They cannot but do the work demanded of them, but they are henceforth mere slaves. Towards the end of winter, Niels's relation to his horses became completely demoralized. One day, when he entered Nellie's stall, carrying hay, while she was eating her oats, he roughly hit her with the handle of the fork because she did not sidle over fast enough. She turned her head and bit at him. He flew into a towering rage, got a short stick of wood, returned into her stall, took her head by the halter, and brought the stick down on her flanks, so that she reared and nearly crushed her colt, which had whisked over to her other side. Ever after she was nervous, almost vicious, when he approached her. As it happened, Bobby had come in just when Niels was punishing her. Instantly, Niels felt ashamed of himself, but he muttered, "I'll show you," as he went out. Back in the open, on the yard, he felt crushed by the weight of the consciousness that he was losing his hold on himself, so much so that he could not bear to face Bobby at once. He went into the implement shed, ostensibly to look for something or other, in reality to hide from the boy. There, in the dark, he sat down on the seat of the binder, without any thought at first, but with a feeling of such unhappiness as he had never felt before. How could he let things get the better of him that way? He, Niels. Are there in us unsounded depths of which we do not know ourselves? Can things outside of us sway us in such a way as to change our very nature? Are we, or are we mere products of circumstance? He felt like a rider on horseback who tries to control his mount when it is under the influence of an uncontrollable panic. Was he, Niels, going insane? If so, what could he do about it? What was that woman doing to him? Was she taking the revenge she had threatened? What did that revenge consist in? Spring came. 100 acres were seeded. And in the house, the woman awoke. The dreaded next move was being made. So far, it consisted in nothing more but that she began to take walks in the bluff where the soil was dry and clean, consisting of the matted roots of grass, low-growing plants, and trees. For these walks, she dressed in the most elaborate way, combing her hair in the latest fashion, and making up with all her art. Niels could not help spying upon her sometimes. He found work that would take him into the cow lot, or perhaps he had something to do in the garden, east of the house. She would walk about in the bluff, sometimes dreamily, sometimes almost gaily, a smile on her face, lost in thought. Or she would take a chair out, or a rug which she spread on the ground, and sit down and read. To a stranger, it would have appeared a very idle. Only had that stranger by chance seen the change in her look when she caught sight of her husband, he would have shuddered at the sudden expression of hatred that came over her face. It was not a mere dislike, not a fleeting aversion. It was the chilling insanity of revenge. Niels never saw her like that, but somehow he too shuddered at her mere sight. He would go to some corner of his farm, perhaps to the grove at the southwest corner, where he was cutting poles to replace rotting fence posts, and he would sit down and brood. He would then almost wish that something decisive, something catastrophic would happen. The fact was that he began to live under a fear. The inactivity of the woman began to unnerve him. What was he to do? Bobby would leave one day. He was growing up. He was 20 years old. But Niels needed Bobby. Bobby was the last link that connected him with the world of living men, the last barrier between him and insanity. The Sundays were the worst. Then Bobby went out. Niels, too, began to go out on Sundays, using his drivers. Then he could be seen driving furiously and aimlessly over the marsh, his hair growing longer and longer on his shoulders, his beard flowing over his breast. People shook their heads. Think, think. A ray of light. Perhaps if he threshed the whole thing out once more from beginning to end, being all alone, he would find some solution. He heard of a certain hay meadow. A storekeeper in Poplar Grove looked after it for the owner. He could always think best when driving. He would go there tomorrow and see. He started out very early in the morning at sunup. Whenever he approached farm or homestead in the bush, he galloped his horses. He would not have needed to fear. If he avoided people in this settlement, the people also avoided him. Nobody knows how rumors spring up in the wilderness. Spring up they do. The story went that Lindstedt was insane, that he was a hermit, that he kept his wife a prisoner on his place. Nobody would have come to the road to exchange a greeting with Lindstedt. Gradually, a definite line of thought evolved. It was almost a year now since the final break with his wife, but he could have reconstructed the whole course of the argument. He had a knack of viewing things most clearly in retrospection. His wife had intended to leave him. He had refused to let her go. Why? Why had he not simply agreed? Would it not have been best for both of them? Of course it would. Had she asked him now to let her go, he would have been glad. He would have welcomed it as a great deliverance. True, it was no longer possible to realize old dreams. His marriage had killed them. His dreams were dead. What if they were? What would life be without her? Not happiness, not what he had once dreamed of as his life, but there would be peace. He could drown himself in work. And the fruits of work? Well, at the worst he could give them away. Why had he refused to let her go? Slowly that summer arose before his memory. Last summer only, and the whole year before it. 3 times she had been in the city. Slowly, out of his brooding over those absences, a question had arisen. This question, what had she been doing in the city? It had disturbed him, gnawed at him, and finally whipped him into the determination not to let her go back to the city. No matter what she had been doing, she was not going to do it again. He understood. During that interview in the dining room, he had been blind. He had been inaccessible to any reason. He had unthinkingly held on to that decision. He understood. He was glad he could interpret his actions so clearly, so accurately. And suddenly the solution of the whole problem flashed up before him. He saw a way out of his labyrinth. Why, it was all clear. There could be no doubt. What he was going to do, what he must do, was this. He must offer to send her away. He must offer money. He must bribe her to leave him alone. He did not go on. He turned his horses and drove home furiously. He reached the farm shortly after noon. It was still early when he saw his wife leave the house for her now accustomed walk in the bluff. He had been waiting about at the stables. For a moment she stood in the door of the house, looking out to the right and the left. She was dressed in a light summer frock of striped zephyr, and she held a parasol of pearl-gray silk over her head. Her face showed a perfect make-up, lips of glowing red, dark brows over dancing eyes, cheeks of pallid smoothness. If she was aware of Niels's presence on the other side of the yard, she did not betray it. His heart sank. She looked the picture of contented happiness, so much so that he began to doubt of the success of his scheme. He wondered what might be going on in that head. He turned and went into the stable. He stopped at the little square window, which, curtained with cobwebs in which dust and chaff were caught, looked out to the north. From there he watched. After a minute or so, the woman, adjusting with an almost convulsive shrug of her shoulders a light shawl about her neck, turned to the east and passed through the lane that separated the kitchen garden, now become a potato patch, from the wall of the lean-to. She disappeared from Niels's field of vision. For a while he busied himself about the stable, irresolutely. Bobby was far away in the southeast corner of the farm, disking. Niels had sent him there on purpose. Now was the time to do what he intended to do. A strange hesitancy took possession of him. Again, he was going to carry out a preconceived plan. He had done so before, and what he had done then was the exact reverse of what he should have done. Perhaps it might be best to wait, to think matters over more fully. He stood and brooded. No, think and then act on the decision arrived at. That was the law of his nature. He could not help himself. It had to be done. For the first and last time in his life, he was conscious of deliberately composing his features for the occasion. End of section 16. Section 17 of Settlers of the Marsh by Frederick Philip Grove. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bruce Pirie. Chapter 5b. Bobby. He found his wife sitting on a rug which, at the northern edge of the bluff, was spread on the ground in a little natural glade shaded by a thicket of plum trees. As he approached, she looked up at him with the old expression of half-mocking friendliness and interest. It disarmed him for a moment. Then he became aware of an uncanny element in that expression. A question arose. Whom did she see? Surely it was not he whom she looked at that way. As if to confirm his thought, her features underwent a change, as if she were, by an effort, recalling her eyes from a distance. She focused them on him. A steely hardness entered them. Her features became hollow under her mask. Haggard, she looked out from behind a screen. Niels's mind worked feverishly. He recalled various things, how he had first seen her without her mask, one morning when he had entered her bedroom before the usual hour, how another face had looked out at him, like a death's head almost, the coarse, aged face of a coarse, aged woman, aged before her time. Other sights rose, full of revelations, but above all, that of how she had stood in that dining room of hers on that fateful September afternoon last year. Then, too, the smile had faded from her lips, the dream had died in her eyes. Niels stood and hesitated. He felt chilled to his very bones. Whatever he might wish, she would, for that very reason, decline. Just then, after a minute of allowing this air of hostility to do its work, she moved and spoke. Her movement consisted in a raising of her head while, with the point of her folded parasol, she tapped the toe of her shoe. Her eye looked straight at him, or rather through him. Her speech was a single word, freezing in its coldness. Well? Niels cleared his throat. Then, haltingly, awkwardly, as he had always spoken to this woman, I have thought this matter over. Something has to be done. I am going to pieces. So are you. If you want to go, I am willing. And there his speech gave out, as a runnel of water gives out in a sand-hole. Her eye had flashed up. A smile had returned to her lips. It was an evil smile. He looked at her aghast. Then she burst into an artificial laugh. No, she said, still laughing. And suddenly she was on her feet, whipped up as if a steel spring had sent her up with enormous power. The laughter had died. She was fury personified. Niels had already turned and was leaving her. With his shoulders bent as he might bend them in a beating, lashing rain, he walked off with long, almost furtive strides. She followed him. "No!" she yelled after him. "That favor I won't do you. No longer. You're going to pieces, are you? Well, let me tell you, I'm not through with you yet. I'll go when I'm ready to go. You're only going to pieces. I won't go till you've gone to pieces." Niels went faster and faster, but she ran after him, stumbling, gathering herself up again, falling, rising, losing her parasol, and finally breaking down and lying there on the yard, just at the corner of the kitchen, where the lane between house and garden came to an end. Niels did not look back. He went straight across the open and into the stable whence he had watched her a while ago. Bobby was there. Some accident had brought him back from the field. He was looking for some piece of harness to replace another which had probably broken. He had heard all, or part at least. What did it matter? Niels paid no attention to him. For a moment the boy, having found what he was looking for, hesitated at the side door which led to the horse lot. Niels waved his hand at him to be gone. Then he stepped back to the little window. There, at the end of the lane, the woman that was his wife was picking herself up from the ground. In stumbling, she had stepped on the hem of her frock and torn it so that it was hanging about her feet. And she stumbled again. She raised her head and looked dazedly about. Her face was bleeding. Earth and chaff, such as gathers on farmyards, were sticking to the makeup of her cheeks. She reached for the corner of the building to steady herself and groped her way along to the door, stumbling once more, bending down and picking up the torn edge of her gown. At last she disappeared inside. Niels's first impulse had been to go to her aid, but he thought better of it. It would not do. He waited 10 minutes, went to fetch rug and parasol, and dropped them into the entrance of the house. Still he hesitated. No, to go upstairs was useless. His mere sight would irritate the woman. It was best to leave her alone. Spring passed by. Summer came. The hay had to be stacked in the slough, then hauled to the yard and restacked there. Showery weather during July doubled and trebled the work. Niels was aging, decaying. Yet the energy and circumspection with which he furthered the work and repaired the damage done to the hay, as far as it could be repaired, were still those of his best years. His care for the farm was almost passionate. But it was the last flicker of a dying flame. Hopelessness and indifference began to show more and more, even in his physique. His shoulders stooped, his features began to sag. He never shaved any longer. His hair hung low. He felt old, tremendously old, centuries old. He felt as if he carried the experience of a world, carried it as an actual load on his shoulders. In daytime he drowned thought in work. At night he read. But even his reading was restricted to one book, the Bible. and in the Bible to one chapter of the Old Testament, Solomon's wisdom. He intoxicated himself in the rhythm of its sentences. He read the same thing over and over again till he knew it by heart. In the field he muttered detached phrases, repeating them 100 times. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. And he who increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place where the rivers go, thither they go again. When he came to the sentence, that which is crooked cannot be made straight, it seemed a comfort. The phrase, there is no prophet under the sun, seemed to echo his own conclusions. And there is no new thing under the sun. No, others had arrived at the same truths as he, kings and high priests. Yet right by his side, life was lived, the life of children who do not look beyond the hour. The child was Bobby. Bobby was getting restless. When he tried to talk and saw that Niels was not listening, he went out and sat on a stone or a block of wood, frowning, dissatisfied. He was a man now, 21 years old. Niels had been more than an employer to him. He had been an idol. Still, he had his own life to make. He could not forever be looking after Niels. But time went and revealed its secrets. Things that were hidden came to light. Bates, a neighbor of Niels's on the southeast quarter of the same section, burned out. He wanted to leave, to give up. He was a city man, drifting back to the city. Niels bought his quarter, bought it for Bobby, to be farmed by him for himself, beginning with the next year. Niels had arrived at something like composure again. It was a dark, pessimistic composure, it is true, but it seemed as if it might last forever. Then that composure also broke down. One afternoon, in cutting time, Niels forsook his binder. Something, he knew not what, prompted him to do so. It was no suspicion, it was hardly an uneasiness. Bobby was stooking. "I'm 2 rounds ahead," Niels said as he let himself down from his seat. "I'll be back before you catch up." He crossed the stubble and disappeared in the grove which bordered his farm in the west. He came to the fence and climbed over it. On the road he looked about. As if it were the first time he saw it, the size of the settlement struck him which had grown up on the marsh. For a moment the sight of all the farms recalled him to reality. He passed his hand over his sweaty brow, sighed, and was on the point of turning back. But the moment he faced his field again, an invincible disinclination to ride that binder took hold of him. He went north along the fence. When he came to the gate, he did not open it, but stepped over the stile which he had built by its side. On the yard he stopped and looked about. All was still, so still that he heard the fluttering of the wings of a bird flitting by. He stared at the house. The door stood wide open. Suddenly his heart began to beat like a sledgehammer. He could hear its thud. Under an irresistible compulsion, he slunk over to the door and stood there listening. Not a sound. He went to the corner of the house, and this time he heard something. Whispers and laughter, half suppressed. He went all the way back to the entrance of the yard. There he turned south into the bush, almost running over the sun-dappled soil between the trees. He went on till he was beyond the stables, and then turned east, circling the whole clearing of his yard. At last he turned north again along pig pens and milk-house till he reached the garden. He vaulted over its pole fence and crossed the potato patch. North of the garden a thicket of plum trees had developed into a dense screen since the lot had been cleared. Niels crouched. Slowly, carefully, he invaded the bush. Suddenly, he stood as if frozen in his attitude. There, right in front of him, not more than 20-30 feet away, unhidden by intervening shrubs or trees, sat his wife, just as he had found her 2 months ago. But by her side sat a man, the younger Dunsmore, his right arm about her shoulder, holding one of her hands in his left. They were whispering and laughing. The man bent over and kissed her on the mouth, long, fervently, with the kiss of a sensual lover. Niels moved. A dry twig snapped under his foot. Then he stood arrested again. The woman's right hand came up and grasped the head of the man from behind, holding it, and beyond and above the head her eyes appeared, staring straight at Niels. She had heard the crackling of the twig. She knew he was there, and she perpetuated the attitude in which she had been caught, enjoying his dismay, perpetuated it for his leisurely inspection. Her eyes held him, looking at him derisively, looking at his shrinking figure and drooping head. Thus the two, man and woman, stared at each other for half a minute. That woman in front of him, in the arms of her lover, was insane. Then the head of the man was lifted and obstructed the woman's look. During that fraction of a second, Niels withdrew into the denser thicket behind. He heard a laugh, the light silvery laugh, not at all artificial, which had rung in his ears for days, years ago. It sounded so sane, contented, so natural, that for a moment he doubted the very testimony of his eyes. What he had seen could not be reality. Then he returned the way he had come. But he did not run this time. He went as if lost in thought. In truth, he was not lost in thought. There was no thought in him. He was merely stunned. He went past his farm onto wild land and sat down. He remained for hours. He was barely conscious. It was late, after 9, when Niels appeared at the shack. He declined supper, but he attended himself to all those of the chores which necessitated entering the house. All else he left to Bobby. Once more Niels was a changed man. True, he rode the binder again, he drove the sheaves to the yard, he plowed the land. But it was Bobby who did the farming. It was Bobby who planned and suggested, directed, instructed. It was Bobby, too, who, when winter came, began the work in the bush. Only one single part of what had to be done on the place Niels attended to without being reminded of it, the part that had to be done in the house. There, nothing betrayed that anybody was living in it, nothing except that the wood box became empty, that the water in the pails sank lower, and that eggs, potatoes, meat were slowly getting less. Niels watched this with fascination. He counted the things which thus disappeared. Apart from that, the decay in Niels consisted more in a gradual disintegration of will and purpose. He became indifferent to everything, even to his comfort. That he went on with the work under Bobby's direction was merely because it was the easiest thing to do. It required no thought, no decision, no break with the past. Winter went by. Life went its way. Bobby seeded his own farm, the quarter section that was to be his. He picked a 4-horse team from among Niels's colts, bargained for them with his employer, and paid in cash. He had the accumulated earnings of years. As for the farm, he would pay in half crops. Bobby was loyal. Seeing that Niels was doing this for him, he would not leave him while he was what he was. But Bobby wanted to get married, to establish himself. Well, even for that there would be a way pretty soon. Haying time. It was Bobby who rented a meadow where the two had never cut before. He was not working for wages in haying. He was working on shares with Niels. The quarter next to the one he rented had been taken by Dahlbeck, the German settler on the bank of the creek. Thus it came about that whenever Bobby and Niels went out to the slough in the early dawn, both sitting on their hay racks, taking 6 horses, in front of them or behind them a third hay rack would be moving along. On it sat Dahlbeck, pale, slim, and wiry, and by his side the Dahlbeck woman, flashy, handsome in her coarse peasant way, and using her eyes to establish a bond between herself and Bobby or Niels. Now it happened that Bobby, in an impulse of impatience at Niels's lethargy, one evening when he was shaving, turned about on him where he was sitting in front of his shack in the dusk, and said jestingly, "Come on, Niels, let me give you a trimming too." Niels looked at him silently, with an almost forbidding disapproval of his jocularity. But Bobby had already taken a pair of clippers. "Come on," he repeated. "Let me, eh?" And Niels let him do as he pleased. "The beard, too?" Bobby asked when he had finished the hair, and he laughed. "Come on now, be a sport. You look like Methuselah." Niels raised his chin. What did it matter? It was not worthwhile to resist. Besides, there was a feeling of physical comfort in the proceeding. "Gee whiz!" Bobby exclaimed when he looked at his handiwork. "You're a young man yet, Niels. I'd almost forgotten. I thought you were old enough to be my granddad by this time." Absent-mindedly, Niels guided his fingertips over his chin and nodded. He got up with a sigh and went about his chores. There was one person who noticed the change at once next morning. The Dahlbeck woman, as everybody called her. She glanced at Bobby and laughed, and Bobby smiled back. It struck the boy that there was a resemblance between Dahlbeck and Niels, not in appearance or anything concrete, but in their outlook on life. Niels and Bobby stacked in the slough, but Dahlbeck took all his dry hay home. The woman raked whenever he was gone. They had no horse rake yet. In the afternoon it so chanced that Bobby wished to draw a load home to be put in the loft of the stable. He and Dahlbeck started at the same time. Niels was on the far side of the stack and never noticed the coincidence. He turned to the mower. That mower, Bobby had said, needed oiling. He knelt down to his task. The horses were standing north of him, their noses to the hay. Suddenly the shadow of a figure fell across the grass in front of him. He winced, and as he looked up, there stood the Dahlbeck woman, laughing at his startled glance. She said nothing. She merely looked at him and let herself down to a squatting posture. Over them stood an almost cloudless sky. The summer had been that typical prairie season in which settled weather is broken only by swift, violent storms, in which the equilibrium of the atmospheric forces is speedily re-established. The slough about them was fragrant with the hot exhalations of the hay. Niels had stopped in his work and was staring at her, the oil can in his hand. At last he spoke. "What do you want?" The woman laughed. She threw herself back in the loose hay that littered the ground. As she did so, her hat fell from her head, bearing tightly rolled tresses of abundant dark brown hair. Her skirt slipped up. The full, strong calves of her legs protruded. "You," she said in a whisper from which the heat of passion breathed. Niels still knelt, motionless. Pictures of the past flitted through his mind, the first that had come to him through many months. The frown on his brow deepened into a scowl. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," he said with distaste. Once more she laughed, and she rolled over in the hay closer to him, so that she nearly touched him. "Joseph," she whispered mockingly. That note of mockery called up the almost forgotten memory of her who was his wife, as she had been one time, and as she had had power over him in years gone by. A feeling of shame swept through him, unnerving his strength. His head sank down on his chest. He had no right to upbraid the woman. He got up, threw the oil can into the toolbox, and went over to where the horses stood. He picked their lines up and guided them to the mower. Nellie stepped over the pole. He hooked the traces into place. The woman, whose laughter had died away, followed every one of his movements with her eye. It was she who was scowling now. And when he clicked his tongue to pull away from her, she sprang up and ran after him, catching hold of his shoulder. She was beside herself with rage. "You hypocrite!" she hissed. "Are you better than other people? I know you, you devil. You can't play the innocent with me. No man can. You least of all. You married the district whore." And for several minutes she went on, pouring abuse from pent-up stores as foam boils from a brimming vessel. But Niels did not hear. He had stopped. His knees shook under him. Lightning had struck him, and the flash had illumined the past as a flash of real lightning illumines a forest trail for him who travels in the dark, making every detail spring out of the night at once. What, in the fraction of a second, he saw, like a panorama, with hundreds of details, all simultaneously, was this: the hesitation of the woman when he had first mentioned marriage to her, Bobby's silence when he had opened the gate for her and him, the atmosphere of a hollow void which had surrounded them when they had come to the Marsh to live, Nelson's words, "You don't mean to say that you don't know," and again, "Then I won't tell you." Hans' remark, "There's one in every district. There's one in yours." And much later the woman's words, "I gave myself, body and all. It was nothing to me." Ellen's, "How could you?" All that and much more Niels saw and heard in that illuminating flash. For a moment he felt that he must pitch forward and faint. Instinctively his trembling hand reached for the machine to steady his swaying body. The woman saw it and stopped in her rush of words. Her eyes became wide. She realized what she had done. She had swung an axe into a great towering tree, and the tree had crashed down at a single blow. She let go of the man, and he dropped the lines and stumbled away. When Bobby returned to the slough, sitting on his hayrack, he found Dahlbeck and the woman at work. The sun was setting. He drove to the stack. Jock and Nellie were hitched to the mower. The lines were trailing behind. They were grazing, their heads bent low. The Clydes still stood at the stack, half asleep, one leg drawn up. Niels was nowhere to be seen. The landscape presented the picture of evening peace. Slowly Bobby went to the other side of the stack and called over to where Dahlbeck was working. Seen anything of Lindstedt? Dahlbeck stopped his team. No, not a thing. Bobby stood undecided. It struck him that the woman who was pitching the last of the day's cutting into cocks did not even turn to look at him. There was nothing to do but to load his rack as best he could alone. He whistled away for a while as he went about the work. Then he became silent. Soon after, the Dahlbecks left the slough on top of their load. Bobby was by nature companionable. The great hollow night that rose about him made him feel lonesome. What was wrong that Niels should be gone? It had never happened before. Yet, come to think of it, it had happened before. When they were cutting and stooking the grain in the harvest field, Niels had walked off. Then, too, Bobby had been puzzled and worried. Niels was going to pieces, there could be no doubt. He was getting to be very queer. A slow, numbing dread took hold of Bobby. There was a memory in the boy's mind of his own foster father, Lund, who had disappeared in the bush. He began to hurry. He had only half filled his rack when he stopped. He pitched his fork up into the load and went to get the other horses. He tied them behind, all four, took his lines, climbed up, and drove through the slough to the road. He had 6 miles to go, but the horses stepped briskly along. What could be wrong? The bush stood silent, motionless. Not a breath stirred. The creaking and rattling of the wheels echoed back to the driver who sat hushed on the load. Now and then the horses snorted. They were wide awake. Horses are watchful, scary at night. At last they came to the east-west road leading to the corner of the bluff. There was the Dunsmore shack ahead, to the left, Dahlbeck's place to the right. On the yard, man and wife were pitching off their load. Even here, no sound except the desultory, almost hesitating bumps and screeches of the rack. Then, ahead, against the paler sky of the west, the bluff loomed up like a huge bowl inverted over what? To dispel the feeling of oppression, Bobby began to whistle once more. He stopped at once. The sound jarred on the silence. He turned the corner and came to the gate. He slipped from the load and stood, listening. Not a sound. Low in the west, the waxing sickle of the moon was hanging, a mere wisp, a little curve of light about to set. There was no wind, but the leaves of the aspens in the bluff were rustling softly. They were never still. On the yard, white buildings stood outlined against the somber bush, some looming high, house, barn, some squatting low, pig pens, cowshed. Nowhere a light. Bobby shivered. He turned to the horses. They, too, listened in the silence. Their ears moved back and forth jerkily. To defend himself against the feeling of dread, the boy began for the third time to whistle. Again he stopped. The sound seemed like a profanation of something. Quickly he opened the gate. The horses pulled at once as if afraid of being left behind, alone. A few minutes later, Bobby had lighted a lantern. He unhitched and untied the horses. He opened the door of the stable. They knew their stalls and, for the moment, needed no further attention. He picked the lantern up and ran to the shack. It was empty. The dishes and the stove had not been touched since dinner time. The alarm clock showed 9:15. Well, he muttered with a phrase of his mother's, I'll be jiggered. He returned to the yard. Once more he looked about and listened. Incomprehensibly, uncannily, he was aware of a new accession of dread. A single horizontal line of light showed in the upper east window of the house. During the past 2 years, the house had often seemed spectral to him, never before as now. Where was Niels? Bobby shuddered. A feeling took hold of him, as if from somewhere in the dark, eyes were looking out at him. A cow lowed on the open marsh. Bobby awoke to life. The herd was coming home. He went about his chores, pumped water, fed pigs. The pigs knew the routine. When he entered the milk house to stir shorts and barley into the milk, they ran along their fence, squealing. In the cow lot, after he had lighted a smudge, the swishing sound of the milk in the pails sounded like company, like a reaffirmation of the common workaday sanity of country life, shutting out the horrors that lurked somewhere. Yet where was Niels? The moon had set. Even the pallor in the northwest of the sky had darkened. It was night. Where was Niels? There was the possibility that he might have gone to the shack meanwhile. No, the shack was empty as before. It was 11 o'clock. Was he to look for him? Was he to give the alarm to the neighbors? His foster father had been helpless, half blind, half lame. He had been out of his senses. Should he enter the house? No, he could not face the woman. He was hungry. He went to the shack again and lighted the stove. As he sat there with the door open, the light of the lamp on the table falling slantways out on the little clearing, and beyond, among the white glistening boles of the young aspens, he, too, began to review what he knew of the woman in the great house, of her who had been the curse of the place. He thought of the shock it had been to him when she had smiled down at him from the seat of the wagon, saying what she had said. He had never known much about her, but he had heard whispers, seen looks exchanged between grown-ups. For a moment, then, Niels had fallen in his esteem, till he had spoken to him in front of the stable. The tone of his voice as he had spoken to him. If only Niels would come home, now, quick. He, Bobby, had sometimes felt harshly towards him of late when he had become so queer. He would never do so again, if only... He rose and busied himself with pots and pans. Niels had been a father to him. He thought of a Sunday years ago when Niels had refused him a horse. Not if you want to go to bad places. Once more Bobby went out on the yard, looking, listening. To the gate, peering along the road, north, south, nothing. It was after midnight when he returned to the shack. He was so worried he did not even enter. He merely glanced at the clock. Then he squatted down on the ground by the door. Sleep must have overcome him at last. He was suddenly conscious of starting up. For several minutes he sat stock still. He thought he had heard something. The first gray of dawn was hovering over the world. His clothes were damp with dew. He shivered, the stillness of death, except for the chirping of some bird. He rose and went into the shack to lie down. Then, just as a few minutes before, in his sleep, the sharp report of a shot. With a jerk, Bobby straightened, every muscle taut. Drowsiness had fallen from him like a cloak. He hurried back to the yard. He saw the stable door open, ran and looked in. There, in the cold gray morning light, stood Niels, the smoking gun still in his hand, and Jock, his horse, was convulsively kicking his last at his feet. End of section 17. Section 18 of Settlers of the Marsh by Frederick Philip Grove. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bruce Pirie. Chapter 5c. Bobby. When Niels had left the slough, he had lost himself in the bush. He went blindly, with unseeing eyes, unthinking brain. Like the bell of doom, the woman's words seemed to reverberate within a hollow vault of brass. There had been thoughts, suspicions, almost certainties, half-faced. There never had been unescapable conviction. From all about him there was only one voice, the voice of the woman. "You have married the—" He went blindly, stumbling over roots and stumps. He was bleeding from nose and forehead. He had lost his cap. He picked himself up again, fell again, tearing his clothes, bruising his limbs. He went on as an animal goes, wounded to death, seeking his lair to hide himself. He was in a trance. 3-4 times he came out on the road. Instinctively he stopped, trying to focus eye and mind on it, swaying from side to side like one drunk. Then he turned back into the thickets behind. 2-3 hours went by that way. Several times he sank to his knees, bending his body low, crouching in an agony of misery. Had anybody met him and asked him sternly, "What is that thought which is lurking beyond the edge of your world, ready to rise above the horizon?" he would have searched in his mind, sincerely, honestly, yet he would have found nothing but a painful, raw void to face, to probe into which, without encountering anything, was baffling, infinitely tormenting. He would have groaned as the man groans on whom a painful operation is being performed while he is under the influence of an anesthetic. Although the onlooker is perhaps from past experience fully aware of the fact that he who lives in that body feels nothing, the groan sounds all the more pitiful, all the more enervating. After hours of such somnambulism, Niels found himself stopped by his own fence. Again he stood, one of his hands resting on the wire, as with an infinite exertion he tried to comprehend, to concentrate his mind on the thing that had stopped him. And as soon as it entered his consciousness that these sloughs, these rising ridges, that bluff 1/2 mile away, were his, he turned back. Behind him were other sloughs, swampy hollows, their soil churned up, trodden and trampled by wandering cattle into little hillocks tufted with grass, hardened by drying, with muddy holes in between where the feet of the heavy beasts had sunk deep. Over these foot-traps he tottered, stumbled, fell headlong, picked himself up again. Once more he was stopped by a fence. Again that slow, painful process of concentration began. Again the fact filtered through the defenses of his mind that the fence was his. His lip curled in a physical sense of distaste. He turned back again. Dusk was rising. When, an hour or so later, the fence stopped him for the 3rd time, he did not turn back. For a while he stood like a man broken by a lifetime of work too heavy for him, bent over, one hand on the post, one on the wire. Then he tried to straddle the fence, stumbled back, and finally went down on his knees, thus crawling onto his own land, where he lay, exhausted. But some impulse was at work in him. Slowly he drew his legs up and raised himself on hands and knees, and at last he got up on his feet. Within 1/2 hour he found himself in a bluff of poplars. He felt his way from tree to tree, supporting himself by his hands, feeling up and down the ridged trunks as if searching for something. In another 1/2 hour he was south of his yard, and then behind the granary, Around its corners he groped his way. When he reached the front, he attacked the door. It took several minutes to open it. His hands seemed to have lost the knack of lifting the latch. It was a high step to take, and in attempting it, he fell headlong. There was a pile of bags hung over the partition between bins. Niels pawed at it till they came down. Then he turned on his back, pushed the bags into a heap, and leaned against them. There he sat, his knees drawn up, his forehead resting on them, his hands lying on the floor. Occasionally he lifted his head like an enormous burden which swayed on his neck, with that reawakening and astonishment with which he who, having gone to sleep in his own bed, finds himself in a strange place, would look about for something to recognize. At first there was nothing but darkness. At last a tiny speck of light stood out just by the door, halfway up the jamb. It was reflected by a highly polished object hanging there. That must be the butt of the big game rifle which he had bought for Bobby. After many attempts to rise, he crawled forward. He had heard a noise, the creaking of a hay rack, the slow step of horses, a snorting, the dull thud of the gate swinging against its stop. The door had swung almost shut. He pushed it half open and lifted his legs over the edge of the threshold till he sat there in the crack of the door. Far out on the yard, the granary stood in a recess of the bush. The light of a lantern moved to and fro about the stables to the east. The lantern burned dimly, its glass was smoky. A curious interest awoke in Niels. Unseen, he saw. The lantern, bobbing up and down, crossed the whole length of the yard, moving quickly. Its dim light illuminated the running legs of the boy, till the door, half shut, closed out the view. From Niels's throat came a sound as if he were chuckling. The light returned. The boy was standing, looking, listening. Niels's eyes were fastened on him out of the dark that screened him. The little dome of visibility ensphering the lantern did not reach to the granary. Niels fought with himself to suppress his laughter. He was playing a prank. He saw. He was not seen. The cows lowed. Bobby returned. Niels began to dangle his feet like a child, or like one who has been sick and has unlearned the art of walking. He delighted in the sense of the motion. But when his heel struck the stones of the foundation below, he started and covered his mouth with his hand, a movement of childish mock fright. Then, after many more comings and goings, Bobby left the yard, not to return. Long, long, Niels sat and stared into the dark. There was just starlight enough to show the outlines. It was all there, the whole picture of the yard, dim and quiet, without its details. His eyes were gradually, automatically adjusting themselves so that when they were called upon, they saw. The call that came consisted in a change of the picture. It was long past midnight. The line of light disappeared from the crack between blind and frame in the upper east window of the house. Instantly Niels saw. He did not move. The change did not at once release any conscious reaction, any thought. The next moment the light reappeared at the lower window, in front of the staircase, throwing a dim glow over the sward of grass on the yard. For a moment a figure appeared in the frame of the window, a woman in flimsy, gaudy undress. An arm, almost bare, reached up to draw the blind so that it intercepted the light. Utter darkness fell, darker than before. But after a minute or so, very dim, almost divined, the light fell into the lane between kitchen and garden. Niels sat very still, frowning. A whole forgotten world came back to him, a distasteful world, not in keeping with his animal comfort. He wanted to put the thought away as it tried to emerge. He was tempted to brush it from his brow with his hand. But he did not move. His hands rested alongside his thighs on the threshold of the door. His body was bent forward. His muscles were tightening, slackening, in reflex action. He stared and did not move. In his mind, in the background of his memory, proceeding from the faintest adumbration of some great fact dominating his life, a question crystallized. What had all this to do with him? With that problem he wrestled for an hour. Again a change in the picture of the yard. Once more the light went on its progress downward in the house. And this time what he saw connected itself with the past, suddenly, without any slow development or unfolding. The whole antecedents of the present moment stood before his mind as if he were living them within fractions of a second. It was like a dream which retrospectively motivates a sound or other perception received in sleep. His muscles tightened and remained tight. It was as if a powerful spring inside of him had been tightly wound and then arrested by some catch, either to snap under the strain or to unroll itself in the natural way by setting some complicated wheelwork into irresistible motion, grinding up what might come in its way or attempt to stop it. Wave after wave of hot blood went through his body, lapping up into his brain, breaking there, flooding his consciousness with an opaque, scarlet flood. He raised himself on his feet without swaying and stood. Then it was as if a cruel wrench had been given that spring inside of him, tightening it to the breaking point. And as that point was reached, he moved. He moved with tremendous speed. The next moment he stood at the door of the house and threw it open. Voices from the back room, laughing voices. "Shh! Nonsense! Who'd come at this time of night?" A third voice, whispering, a roar of laughter. That released the tightly wound spring. Irresistibly, a clockwork began to move. There was not a spark of consciousness in Niels. He acted entirely under the compulsion of the spring. He remembered later, much later. He was back at the granary and reached into the door for the gun. He made sure it was loaded. Again he crossed the yard and entered the house noisily, without taking precautions. He went through the front room and threw the door to the dining room open. There, consternation had done its work. A man's figure, half-clad, was vaulting through the open window to the right. A second one was fleeing through the door into the kitchen. At the left, the woman was sitting, her face made up, her body wrapped in silks. On the table, dishes, plates, cups, a biscuit bowl, a teapot. The woman rose, a half-frightened, half-triumphant smile on her face. She sought his eyes, but she looked into the barrel of the gun. The shot rang out. She screamed and ran for the kitchen door, upsetting a chair on her way, but before she reached it, she fell, flinging her arms and kicking her feet so that a silken slipper fell in the center of the table. Then she went quiet and lay in a heap. Niels had already turned, slamming both doors as he went. Again he crossed the yard. He entered the stable. He could never remember why he had done so. He went through the driveway and east towards the horse lot. There, in this short aisle, in neighboring stalls, stood Jock and Nellie, just visible in the dim light of dawn. Niels, swaying again, came very near to the rump of the gelding. Jock, as the door was opened, had turned his head. When his master swayed near him, he, expecting a blow, kicked out. Niels raised his gun and shot the gelding through the head. All that day Niels slept, a deep, sunken sleep. Bobby had pulled the dead horse out of the stable, putting the chain around his rigid hind legs and hitching the Clydes to the chain. It would have seemed a sacrilege to use the young Percherons for such a purpose. Niels slept. Bobby did the chores. He milked the cows, watered the cattle, and let them out on the marsh. He brushed the horses, untied them, and opened the door to the lot. Niels slept. Bobby maneuvered the hay rack against the door of the stable and pitched the hay into the loft. Niels slept. Bobby was now convinced that he had heard 2 shots. He looked Jock over. He found only 1 bullet hole. He went to the shack and fetched the rifle. Its capacity was 5 shots. It had been fully loaded. There were 3 shells left. Bobby looked at the house that stood in the morning sun, as it had stood there on every day since he had known it. There was something uncanny about it. He shuddered. What was he to do? He could not go to the hay slough alone this morning. Niels had not said a word. He had thrown the rifle over his shoulder and gone to the shack, slowly, steadily, soberly. There he had flung himself on the bed, in his clothes, vouchsafing no information, inviting no question, answering no inquiring look. "Don't you want breakfast?" Bobby had asked. Niels had already been asleep. Bobby went all around the house. The east window of the dining room on the north side was open. Should he look in? He could fetch the sawbuck or a truss from the milk-house to stand on. He did not go. He was afraid to look in. He returned to the yard, picked the rifle up where he had left it leaning against the stable, broke the barrel, and emptied the remaining shells into his hand. Something frightful had happened. What? He felt disconsolate. Niels had never owned shotgun or rifle, but one day in winter, a year or 2 ago, Bobby and Niels had been coming from the shack, and there, in the first frosty light of the morning, they had seen a moose standing at the far corner of the garden lot, head thrown high, mobile nostrils a-quiver to catch a scent. Both men had stopped in their tracks. Then Bobby, bending down, had picked up a stick and sprung forward, leveling it like a gun at his shoulder, shouting, "Bang! Bang!" Whereupon the noble animal, all nerves and trembling muscle, had reared up and disappeared in long, graceful bounds. "What a pity," Bobby had exclaimed, "that we haven't a gun." Niels had shrugged his shoulders, but the next time he had gone to town, he had brought back this rifle for Bobby. It had never been used except for practice and in fun. If it had not been for him, Bobby, there would have been no firearms on the place. Many times during the forenoon, Bobby went to the shack. Niels never stirred. Bobby became hungry, but Niels needed the rest. He merely fetched some bread and a cup, went to the pump, drew fresh water, and sat down to munch his crusts. Bobby had no education. If you had asked him what a tragedy is, he could not have answered. but he felt that a tragedy had been enacted in the house. Niels had been young, strong, enormously strong, handsome, clean, competent, yes, and good. Bobby had seen him decaying, slowly, steadily, irrevocably. Now that he came to think about it and look back at what he had been during the last few months, he felt profoundly shaken. He felt shattered in his belief in the firm foundations of life. His own life would have to be lived under the shadow of what had happened to Niels, of what would happen to him. He could never be the same carefree boy again. He had often, of late, heard Niels mutter certain words. On this summer day they took a meaning for Bobby. And he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. He had been happy, constitutionally happy. He would never be quite so happy again, but he would be more thoughtful. More thoughtful? Had he not been thoughtful enough in the past? On the contrary, had he been thoughtful in his relation to Niels? Had he not often of late been impatient with him? Had he not shrunk from the careless, untidy habits into which he had fallen? Bobby, young as he was, came to know the bitterness of regret and repentance. Several times he rose, walked about, fought down his sobs. Niels lay like a log. All life on the marsh would be changed. Slowly the sun rode on and finally sank to the west. At last, late in the evening, when its rays came almost parallel with the ground, Niels awoke. He raised himself till he was sitting on his bed, his feet on the floor, his shoulders curved forward, his hands lying by his sides. As Bobby darkened the door, he looked up. His eye was clear, but his look came from another world. "It's evening, is it?" he asked. His voice, too, sounded as from an infinite distance. Bobby nodded, a lump in his throat. "Get something to eat," Niels said, without stirring. Bobby began to work as if a great deal depended on his speed. His hands shook. He dropped this, spilt that. He started a fire, fried eggs, made tea. Niels got up, slowly, heavily, stretched himself, and went out to where the wash basin stood on a homemade bench. There he washed, slowly, painstakingly, splashing and brushing for fully 5 minutes. With the same painstaking care, he dried face, neck, arms. When he re-entered the shack, he sat down at the table, heavily, as if his weight had increased tenfold. Bobby, too, sat down, but he could not eat for the dull, numbing excitement that was in him. Every now and then, while Niels satisfied his appetite, eating slowly but in great, enormous bites, his eye rested for a moment on the boy. He finished and made an attempt to rise. The attempt failed, or was given up. At last he pointed over the table with a sweep of his arm. "Clear that off." When Bobby, working feverishly, had done so, Niels added, "Bring pen and ink, and the bundle of papers from the cupboard." Niels lifted his arms onto the table as if they were weighted with lead. He tore the string that held the bundle of papers and picked out his checkbook and a large folded parchment. He tried to remove the stopper from the ink bottle. Failing, he said, "Open that." He dipped the pen and began to write in large, stiff, unwieldy scrawls. When he had finished, he wheeled about on his chair, nearly falling. "Bobby," he said, as if speaking, too, were very difficult. "There's the patent for my land. It's yours, with all that's on it. Here's a check. There's something owing on the other quarter. It's the full amount. I won't be back." "Niels," Bobby cried, almost choking with sobs, "what have you done?" "I," Niels said with a sudden flicker in his eye, "I have killed my wife." "Oh, God," Bobby groaned. "I was afraid that was it." "Afraid," Niels said, slowly and sternly. "What have you to be afraid of? You've been a son to me. I leave you my property." "Niels," Bobby cried. He would have liked to throw himself on this man, to hold him, to shield him with his body. Niels waved him back. "Niels," Bobby cried again, "what are you going to do? You must hide." "Hide? No, I am going to town." And slowly, heavily, he rose and went to the door. Bobby was beside himself. Niels turned back, swallowing 2, 3 times. "Bobby," he said at last, "you've been a son to me. I want to thank you." "Don't!" Bobby cried, flinging his arms up. "I can't stand it." "Stand it?" Niels repeated. "I am going to town to hand myself over." He took a step or two till he stood in the middle of the little clearing. "Don't try to hold me. Don't follow me." Bobby did not move. He stared at the man. Niels stood for another few minutes, his lips muttering words. Then, mastering his refractory body, he pulled himself up, and for a moment his voice became articulate and distinct, though not loud. "Hanged by the neck until dead." Everything seemed to turn about Bobby. Then, when he looked again, the man on the clearing was gone. End of section 18. Section 19 of Settlers of the Marsh by Frederick Philip Grove. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bruce Pirie. Chapter 6a. Ellen Again. In due course of time, a trial followed, conducted in a small city of the prairies. The prisoner at the bar had refused to engage a lawyer for his defense, nor did he utter a word which might throw light on the crime or on his motives. In plain, unequivocal terms, given in writing, he pleaded guilty to the charge of murder. During the preliminary investigation, a doubt had arisen as to his sanity. He protested strongly against that suspicion. He was perfectly sane, perfectly responsible for his actions, so he asserted, when he shot the woman. He would do so again should the occasion arise. But the court appointed a lawyer for him. In capital cases, a plea of guilty is valueless. The lawyer felt that this trial might be the making of his career. He went himself into the marsh and questioned a good many people, neighbors of the accused, Bobby, Mrs. Lund, Ellen Amundsen, Hahn, Nelson. Thus, on the day of the trial, there appeared some 20 persons subpoenaed by the defense. The Crown had only one witness as to matters of fact, Bobby Lund, who had heard the shots and seen the prisoner with the gun in his hands. Apart from that, it rested its case entirely on circumstantial evidence, which was, indeed, amply strong enough. The prisoner showed considerable impatience while his counsel conducted the defense. The indictment read for murder. He admitted his guilt. What more was there to be said? But the case went its course as prescribed by law. The court, seeing that the prisoner appeared to be almost anxious to incur the maximum penalty, that of death by hanging, was all the more inclined to be exceedingly careful, to weigh every testimony as to the prisoner's antecedents, his character, the many good deeds ascribed to him, and the character of the murdered woman. The young lawyer made the most of every favorable circumstance. By the time the case was ready to go to the jury, no onlooker could have any doubt any longer as to the outcome. An acquittal was impossible, but so was a conviction on the charge of murder. The jury found the prisoner guilty of manslaughter with attenuating circumstances and recommended him to the mercy of the court. The verdict read for 10 years in the federal prison with hard labor. A few miles north of the great city of the plains, there rises abruptly, out of the level prairie, the brow of a hill. It does not look imposing from a distance, but as, coming from the city, you approach it, driving perhaps in a car, and as the hill rises before you, it is apt to take on, in the impression it makes on your imagination, much larger proportions than its natural dimensions would warrant. That impression is due to the sinister suggestiveness of the work of man, for the brow of the hill is crowned with a group of buildings of truly titanic outline. A perpendicular wall rises up 50 feet high, many feet thick, a smooth wall built of limestone blocks, stretching for several hundred feet from east to west, and forming, behind, a perfect square by its enclosure. In the center of the south end there is a gate, wide and high, but completely closed by steel bars 4 inches apart. A man, armed from head to foot, always paces the arched gateway behind. On top of the walls at every corner there stands a small tower, from which, also on top of the walls, there stretch 2 parapeted walks at right angles to each other, reaching halfway to the center of each side of the square. Each of these towers offers, when such is needed, shelter to 2 men who, armed with rifle, revolver, and sword, walk back and forth on their beats. Every few hours they are relieved, others mounting guard, day and night. Yes, when you approach that hill, you cannot get near it without being challenged. Men on horseback patrol every possible approach, their mounts being swift and strong. If you are alone in your car, you may be allowed to pass unquestioned. A single person can hardly be the bringer of any danger. If there are 2 or 3 of you, you will have to state your business before being allowed to proceed on the last half-mile of the journey. If a crowd is with you, you will be turned back, or at least detained. Should you by any chance ignore the challenge, your car, disabled, will run into the ditch. In any case, before you reach the walls, every eye is watching for you. Every move of yours is being followed. The report of your coming has preceded you, no matter how fast you may have traveled. Altogether, the impression these precautions make is that of a terrible, implacable grimness, like that of doom. Inside the huge enclosure, which is thus protected against any unauthorized approach, you divine more than you see, 6 buildings which harbor the prison, the shops annexed to it, and the offices of the administration. Outside, nestling against the talus of the hill, there are 2-3 large houses, brick-built, the residences of warden, physician, chaplain. Behind it, north of it, a little town grovels at its feet. Some 200 outcasts spend from 2 to 30 or 40 years of their lives within that enclosure, at labor which brings them no return. As in the morning they file out from the dormitory, tier upon tier of steel-barred cells where they have spent the night alone between 3 walls, for in front of the steel bars which form the 4th wall a guard paces up and down, You are apt to shudder at sight of these unfortunates who walk along in single file, in groups of 10 or 20, silent, accompanied by a guard. When at noon they return from the shops, silent again, in groups of 10 or 20, and in single file, they pass, in the huge kitchen which occupies the basement, along heated steel shelves on which a bowl waits for each one of them, filled with food to be taken to the cell and to be eaten there in silence, in solitude, and yet not in privacy. After an hour or so they file out again to the shops. And yet, even here, a human heart beats, human sympathy plans the welfare of others, the heart of the warden. There was a time when the prisoner trembled or scowled at sight of an officer. That time is past. Today, when the warden appears, most of the prisoners, those for whom there is hope of a future outside, or of manhood in some form inside, most of them smile. The warden is a fearless man. He goes unarmed. He is the friend of the unfortunate. He has a way with him which gains their confidence. It was long, very long, before he gained Niels Lindstedt's confidence, but he did not give up, and gain it he did. He spoke to him often during the first 2-3 years. After that, prisoner number 187 as often, spoke to him. It was the warden who made him think, remember about the past. It was the warden who slowly made him see that he was not an outcast, a being despised for what he had done. It was the warden who told him that he, too, placed in the same circumstances, might and probably would have acted as Niels had acted. It was the warden who held out hope that perhaps within another 2-3 years. It was the warden who corresponded for him with Bobby Lund. No, said the warden, Bobby Lund would never dream of accepting the farm as a present. He had his own farm. He was looking after Niels's stock, after his land. He was holding it in trust against his return. It was his, Niels's, duty to go back to this land. It was the warden who spoke to him of Ellen. After the 4th year, Niels attended evening classes conducted by the schoolmaster of the village, high school classes. He learned something of French and Latin, of algebra, geometry, science. He acquired a vocabulary which would enable him to read real books. He was often puzzled by the abstruseness of it all. Finally, he was amused. He learned to laugh at man's folly in puzzling out such curiosities of the mind. What had it all to do with the real problems of life? But he kept at it. He even passed examinations. And one day in his 6th year, the warden entered the blacksmith shop, where Niels, at his own request, had been employed, and told him that he had succeeded in his intercession with the minister of justice. The end of Niels's term of confinement had been fixed for the spring of the following year, limiting the total time he had to serve to 6 years and a half. Once more, during the latter days of April, Niels was on his way from Minor to the farm in the margin of the Marsh, walking. It was daytime. He had dropped off the train at noon. 4 or 5 miles from town, he found things so changed that he could no longer follow the old-time trail athwart the sand flats. An almost continuous settlement covered the formerly wild land over which the trail had angled. He had to go straight east to follow roads or road allowances. Where they were not sandy, he sank to his ankles in mud. The thaw-up had just been completed. When he reached the range line, he was 6 miles south of his farm. This was the middle of what had been the northern part of the marsh. The marsh itself was also changed. Formerly, the range line trail had followed a sandy, gravelly ridge swinging east and west. The road followed a straight line now, being graded wherever it led through lowlands, flanked by ditches which were drained by huge master ditches running crosswise and carrying the water to the lake. Right at the corner, where once there had been nothing but swamp, lay two prosperous farmsteads close together, and nothing but the hedgerows of swamp alder which bordered the fields reminded of the marsh as it had been. They, too, being deprived of the water they needed, would soon disappear. Half a mile north, another prosperous farmstead, a new frame house with porch and sleeping balcony, and a huge up-to-date barn which dwarfed the landscape round about. Still further north, the hovels of German and Icelandic settlers had been replaced by new buildings, some of them painted, some unpainted, but all of them bearing the imprint of truly Canadian settlements. Niels felt intimidated. This prosperity which had invaded the marsh was unexpected. The old pioneers had receded to the margin of civilization. A new generation had taken hold. The change was not entirely welcome. He was of the old generation which had been evicted. On almost every farmstead he saw a garage. Cars had always been his pet aversion. The old familiar bluffs had been cleared away. Fields stretched in their places. About the yards, straight-lined plantations of imported trees framed the clusters of buildings. This was no longer the bushland he had loved. He came to the corner of the section on which his own land lay. He stopped and put his bundle down to look about. For a moment he was not even sure it was the section. And yet a lump rose in his throat. There, in the evening sun, ahead of him, stood the bluff, still bare of leaves, but towering and dominating the landscape all about. No barns could dwarf it. Beyond, the cliff of the forest still fringed the creek. He looked east. A mile away, in the very margin of the bush which, many miles wide, bordered the west shore of the lake, a smaller farmstead became visible to his searching eye. That was the old Bates place, the place he had bought for Bobby in the long-ago past. Yes, there was a small house, log-built, so it seemed, a little stable, and 2 or 3 other small buildings, all of logs. That would be Bobby's establishment. Bobby was married. And ahead, where the small grove of second-growth aspens had marked his own line to the west, big towering trees stood, a narrow strip of them between road and fields, quiet in the evening sun. He picked his bundle up and went on. To the west, too, there were farmsteads, 2 in the open sand flats, log buildings, these. How could anyone make a living there? One, in the margin of the bush that fringed the creek, this one a large, ambitious establishment. That must be the old Sigurdsson place? He went on and came to his corner. He looked at the fence. It was in good order. Here and there rotting posts had recently been replaced. Again a lump rose in his throat. He had come to a gap in the young bush fringe which he had spared when he cleared his land. Through it he saw horses grazing along the edge of the field which lay black-ridged, duly fall-ploughed. They were Percherons, purebred. He knew the breed. And was not that aged mare there, that lifted her head and gazed at him, was not that Nellie? Putting down his bundle, he climbed the fence. Tears were trembling in the corners of his eyes as he approached the horse, his hand outstretched. But she eyed him warily, and with a sudden motion which fully betrayed her identity. a peculiar throwing of the head, chin upward, while her ears flicked back flat on her head, she scampered away, 10, 12 younger horses breaking cover out of the bush and following her. Niels laughed. His laugh was shot with tears. He returned to the road and went on. There, ahead of him, was a small gate in the fence. He did not know it. It was new. Curiously he approached. A white sign was fastened to the gate-post by its side, a sign with blue letters. It bore the words "Post Office" as its legend. He saw that a path led from the gate through the bush fringe up to a little house. Should this be the shack in which he and Bobby had lived in the past, which was now so remote? The shack that had first been built for old man Sigurdsson, dead and buried these 10 years and more? And who might be living there now? But that remained to be cleared up later. He went on. Yes, there was the big gate that led on to his place, with the stile by its side, just as he had left it. His heart began to beat faster, faster. Then the vista opened on his yard. There stood the buildings: granary, stable, cowshed, implement shed, pig pen, milk house, and dwelling. There was the horse lot, the garden behind the house, the cow enclosure north of the entrance in the bluff. Yes, there was one thing he felt sure of. No matter what else his future might hold, in joy or sorrow, this would be home, his refuge, his hermitage. Slowly he stepped over the stile. As of old, he went all about the place, looked into the granary where grain, oats and barley, was stored, into the stable, empty but for one old horse, a Clyde that stood blind and lame in his stall, into the pig pen where 6 pigs came grunting and sniffing to meet him, into the milk house where tin pails were inverted over stakes driven into the earthen floor, scoured and shining. All was as it used to be. He looked at the house. Should he enter? There were new curtains on all the windows. On the lower floor the blinds were drawn. His heart pounded like a hammer as he touched the doorknob and turned it. It was almost dark inside. He entered. The hall was empty. From it the staircase led up, without banisters, into the upper story, where there was still a little light. A shudder ran over him as he thought of entering the north room. No, he would go upstairs instead. He climbed the steps. The door to the east room was closed, that to the west room open, the reverse of what it had been in his time. In the west room stood his old bed, made up as if to receive a guest. The curtains were of scrim which he recognized. Slowly he turned back to the landing. Slowly, hesitatingly, he opened the door to the other room. It was empty except for crates and boxes stored there. From that sight, Niels took courage and went down again. There, in the hall, he stood for a moment. His huge frame seemed to shrink. But at last he raised one of the blinds, went to the rear of the room, and turned the knob. The first object that struck his sight was the old tin heater of his bachelor days. The second one, the deal table, covered with oilcloth. The third, a piece of cardboard, lying on it, inscribed with a blue pencil, "Welcome home." He sat down on a chair, overcome with a strange feeling. It was almost happiness. Lastly, he went into the kitchen. There everything looked as if he had just left it. There were eggs in the colander on the shelf where they used to be. A smoked ham lay on the table with the butcher knife beside it. The water pail stood on the bench by the door, filled to the brim. Everywhere on the lower floor, too, scrim curtains were hung in the windows. Who had put them there? Well, who but Bobby? Bobby had tried to wipe the past out as far as Niels was concerned. He had removed whatever might remind him of it. Bobby was like a son. It was chilly in the house, the season being still early. So after a while Niels lighted a fire in the little stove. Then he sat again and mused. It would be a lonely life, a life like that of his first winter in the north in Nelson's shack. Still, it would be home. He remembered how that little shanty of Nelson's had first seemed like home to him. There he had felt anchored for the first time after his wanderings. He had played with and rejoiced at the thought that he had already money enough to put up such a shack for himself. This house, a big house, but no longer the largest or best-built house for many miles around. It was over 12 years ago now since it had been built. Just how long was it? Yes, it must be 13 years. This house could never be what a little shack would be. It would always remind him of, always oppress him with, the thought of the years which he had lived here, not alone. There was that other shack on this very place, but it was occupied. And for the first time he wondered, by whom? Just then a commotion arose outside on the yard. A voice was calling, a strong, almost masculine voice, which he yet recognized as that of a woman, Mrs. Lund. He went into the bare front room and looked out through a crack between blind and frame of a window. There, in the darkening dusk, Mrs. Lund stood in the horse lot, the southern gate of which she had opened. She stood upright, her hands raised to her mouth as a megaphone, calling. "Come on," she called. "Come on, come on, come on." And the horses obeyed. They knew her. They knew her voice. Slowly through the bush beyond they approached the gate, and when they had reached it they tossed their heads, shot past the strong grey-haired woman that stood there with a brief spurt of a gallop, drank at the trough, and filed into the stable, one by one. His horses, Percherons all, there were 12 of them of all ages, with Nellie, the oldest one, following last. Mrs. Lund was closing the gate, and when she had done so, she too went after them into the stable. It was getting dark. Niels felt that he should go out, but something held him back. Yes, of course, it was Mrs. Lund who was looking after the place. It was she who lived in the shack. It was she who was keeping the post office, as in the past. Once more thoughts flooded in on him. He visualized things that had happened long ago. One day in the past he had gone to Odense to get Mrs. Lund so she would cook for the threshers on his place. "They've sold me out now," Mrs. Lund had said with reference to her little store in the village. "Couldn't Nelson have done something?" Niels had asked. "Oh, Nelson! He's getting to be altogether too big for the likes of me. He has no time to be thinking of his poor mother-in-law. Nelson, the big cattle man. Olga, of course, would like to help. But there are the children. And I suppose she has her own worries, too." "Have you a place yet?" "Yes," Mrs. Lund had answered. "Yes, and a good place, I think, at Judge Cameron's at Poplar Grove. But to think that at my time of life I must still go again and hire out to do housework." "In a few years," Niels had suggested, "Bobby will get a place." And Mrs. Lund, with suddenly renewed animation, relapsing into her grandiose manner, had fallen in with him. "Yes, Mr. Lindstead, what's true must be true. Bobby's a good boy. Bobby's a clean boy, Mr. Lindstead. Thanks to you. Bobby's the hope of my old age. We took him from the children's home. We gave him what we could. We kept him as if he had been our own. He will remember. He'll do the right thing by me when the time has come." Had Bobby done so? No doubt he had. And here she was, taking care of his, Niels's place. Again Niels sat and mused. "No," the warden had said to him one day in the prison, "how you stand with God, I cannot tell. God keeps his own counsel. But let me remind you of the great sinner who had been a bad man all through his life, but on the cross he repented, and Christ forgave him. Niels, though you have sinned, I don't think you've been a bad man." And searchingly he had looked into his eye. And Niels had answered, after a silence of thought, slowly, hesitatingly, "No, I believe I have tried to do what was right in most things. I've been self-seeking when I was young. I have too often thought of my own life only. As for the thing that has sent me here, I don't blame myself, not for that immediate thing, but for what preceded it, for what led up to it, for the very beginning of it, many years before it happened. I have long since seen that I had sinned." "Niels," the warden had gone on, "if I'm any judge, God has forgiven you. The killing, that too was in the atonement. But as for men, you have been judged by your peers, and you have paid the penalty. You have taken life, yet they have judged you fit to live on. What I'd like you to feel is this. When you go out of here, you can hold your head up. You must hold your head up. As far as human justice goes, you have paid the price." And yet it was hard. Out there, the woman went about doing the chores on his place. Could he face her? But face her he must. Then the front door of the house was opened. "Anybody in here?" Mrs. Lund's voice called. Niels rose and stood silent, a lump in his throat, his heart pounding fast. "Yes, Mrs. Lund," he answered at last. "I'm here. Niels." "Mr. Lindstedt," she sang out, and came running in. "Where are you? We didn't know just when to expect you. I saw smoke coming from the chimney. It's so dark. Where are you?" "No," Niels said, "don't light a lamp yet." "Oh," Mrs. Lund said. "Well, I won't then." And they shook hands in the dark. "Sit down," Niels said. "Sit down." And Mrs. Lund sat and cried. "Excuse me, Mr. Lindstedt," she said. "Excuse an old woman. You've been our benefactor when we were poor. We've been worried about you." "How's Bobby?" Niels asked after a while. "Bobby, fine. Bobby's a farmer, Mr. Lindstedt, thanks to you. He's doing fine. Considering, he's only a beginner, but he's going to give me a home as soon as he can. It was he who thought of putting me here for the time being, so we could be together at least. I've got the post office again, It relieved him of so much work to have me here. I'm an old farmer myself, You remember how we worked on the place in the edge of the slough. Poor Daddy, he couldn't do much any longer. Oh, Mr. Lindstedt, he was the best husband, the very best. God have mercy on his poor soul. But it all went to smash. You know that, too. Bobby's fine, thank the Lord. Not that he's rich. He's married. You've heard about that, I suppose. She's a daughter of Henry Kelm, George Kelm's brother. She's a good girl, I can assure you, Mr. Lindstedt. She's a fine girl, a real helper. And they've 5 children by now." "5?" Niels echoed. "Yes, sir, 5. 5 little Bobbies on the place. 2 pairs of twins, all boys, and 1 girl." Niels smiled in the dark. "That's as many as Nelson's got. He's got only 5, But Nelson, of course, has a car, a big one, I don't know what you call them, an underground or something. And he's got a new 8-roomed house of brick." "Well, well," Niels said. And now, Mrs. Lund, I don't think I'd mind any longer if you lit the lamp. You know so much better where to find it than I." Mrs. Lund bustled about excitedly, and when she came back the two looked at each other by the light of the lamp which she was carrying in her hand. "Well, I declare," Mrs. Lund exclaimed, "you're looking younger and better than when I saw you last." She stopped, for when she had seen him last there had been a woman in this house, sitting in the corner of the kitchen, gossiping with her and Mrs. Schulze. She had been clad in a silk dressing-gown, and she had been smiling ironically from morning till night, smiling at such trivialities as threshing. But Niels merely nodded. Mrs. Lund, on the contrary, looked older, much older than she had done at the time, though on closer scrutiny the impression arose perhaps chiefly from the fact that her hair was light grey, almost white. In Niels's mind, far back, there hovered a question which he did not dare to ask. "But the changes," Mrs. Lund went on, "the changes, Mr. Lindstedt. You won't recognize the Marsh any longer. Nearly all the old settlers are gone. The Dahlbecks are gone, the Schultzes. Mr. Schulze was frozen to death the year after, well, you know. The Bakers, the Wagners, the Smiths, they proved up and sold and went. That's the way it's been going in this settlement, Mr. Lindstedt. Bobby and you and Kelm and Ellen Amundsen, that's all there are left of the old bunch now." Niels closed his eyes. Then he smiled. There was one thing left for which he had to atone. He had doubted and worried and doubted about that one point. He had come to the conclusion that if he found the girl still living in the bush, he would take it as a sign that once more there would be peace, once more there would be some semblance of life left for him in the future. Mrs. Lund saw, divined, and kept her peace. At last Niels rose. "Mrs. Lund," he said, "would you mind helping me once more with my chores? I'll be awkward, I'm afraid. I've lost the knack of things. There's the milking still to do, I suppose, and the feeding. And when we are through, we'll go and call on Bobby?" "Sure," Mrs. Lund replied. "I'll hustle up." There was hay in the loft of the barn, crushed oats in the bin. The cows came home. It was 8 o'clock when the chores were done. Mrs. Lund went into the house and lighted the kitchen stove. Niels remained on the yard, going here and there. In the farthest corner, on the east side, behind pig pens and milk-house, he came across a pile of squared timbers which he had cut and squared with Bobby in years gone by. They had been meant for a smoke-house. They were dry and sound. He stood and mused. Would he ever be able to establish a routine again? Would he ever be able to do the work on the farm? And yet already the place was home. He, Niels, 40 years old, 40 years. Mrs. Lund called for supper. An hour or so later they crossed the farm, following a footpath worn into the soil, no doubt, by Mrs. Lund, by Bobby, his wife, and his children. That footpath suggested that there were neighbors, friendly neighbors. There had never been any before. They approached the place in the dark. 2 dogs came running and barking to meet them. They sniffed at the woman and wagged their tails. They sniffed at the man and growled. "Down, Mickey," Mrs. Lund called. "Down. The house is all dark. They must have gone to bed." In front of them a little shanty squatted low, with a lean-to, tar paper tacked to the walls all around. On the north side a little snow lingered, a frozen pile, showing grey in the black of the shadows about. The shanty looked hump-backed, one-eyed, crippled. Mrs. Lund sang out, "Bobby!" It sounded like an echo of ancient memories through the night. "Yes," a voice answered from within. "Just a minute." And a few moments later the door of the lean-to opened, and out stepped Bobby. He was in shirt and overalls, barefooted, his hair rumpled. He looked lean and wiry, even in the dark. "Hello, Mother," he said. "Come in." "Bobby," she said, "I'm not alone." And only then Bobby noticed the broad, dark figure of the man by her side. "Gee whiz!" he exclaimed. "It's Niels. Come in." And he ran back into the house to light a lamp. Niels entered the kitchen. It was a small, bare room with an old table, a bench, and 3 or 4 boxes for seats. On the east wall there were a few shelves, in the center a cook stove. The joists showed. The walls were single-boarded of box lumber tacked to scantling. The floor of raw planks, rough, splintered, but clean, strewn with sand. Bobby was so excited that he did not even think of properly greeting Niels, nor of making excuses. A moment later a woman entered, blinking in the light, barefooted, young, strong, but overworked. "That's the missus," Mrs. Lund said. And Niels, looking at her out of kind, searching eyes, shook her hand, which she gave without answering the pressure and without looking into his face. "We'd expected you, of course," Bobby said, "but we didn't know the exact date." Niels looked at him. He was thin, his face not as merry as it used to be. He was older, maturer, ripened by worries, thoughts, regrets. "We'd gone to bed," Bobby went on, "to save oil, you know." And he laughed. Niels listened to that laugh. No, there was no harshness, no bitterness in it. He had not expected to find the poverty he saw. "You'll stay overnight?" It was Mrs. Lund's turn to laugh. "Nonsense, Bobby. Mr. Lindstedt has a good bed at home. Why should he sleep in your bunks?" "Well," Bobby replied, "that's true, too. We have no bedsteads yet," he explained to Niels. "Or any longer, I should say. You know, 4 boys tear a lot of clothes. We sold our own bedstead last winter to buy shoes for the kiddies. But if the bunk isn't too hard, we've got the room." Again Mrs. Lund laughed her broad, hearty laugh. "Room! It's some room, all right. There aren't even panes in the window. The dogs jump in at night." Niels had been looking from one to the other. The young woman, yes, she was a mate. She had no doubt been pretty, with the prettiness of youth. Now she looked helpful, rather. But was not that what was needed? He turned. "Never mind, Mrs. Lund. I'll stay." The young woman, clad in a thin gingham house dress, had busied herself at the stove. She was shy, bashful in the presence of a stranger. "Tea or coffee?" she asked Bobby, not caring to address Niels directly, and Bobby turned to Niels with an inquiring look. "Tea," Niels said, understanding her at once. And to Bobby, "And now let me see the children, will you?" They tiptoed into the adjoining room. All 5 were sleeping in one of the 2 bunks. The other was empty. For a while Niels stood and looked, by the light of the little lamp that was burning there. The boys were red-faced, fat-cheeked youngsters, the girl somewhat thin and pale. The bedding consisted of blankets, grey, none too warm. In lieu of a mattress, a layer of hay was spread on the boards. Niels looked back in his memories on that room of Lund's, where a second-hand defunct gentility had prevailed, the same poverty, but here the poverty of a beginning. There it had been the poverty of the end. "We're none too well fixed," Bobby said. "Well," Niels pondered. "We've only 30 acres so far. We'll get things as soon as the land is paid for." "The land?" But Niels broke off and turned to go back into the kitchen. There Mrs. Lund received him in quite her old manner. "Mr. Lindstedt," she said, "all this does not look very prosperous yet, but one day, we are going to have everything as it should be, a large, good house, a hotbed for the garden, real up-to-date stables, and everything." And Bobby and Niels both nodded. End of section 19. Section 20 of Settlers of the Marsh by Frederick Philip Grove. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bruce Pirie. Chapter 6b. Ellen Again. During the next few days there were many things to be discussed. Bobby had for 7 years looked after the field work on Niels's farm. He had never touched a cent of the proceeds. He had banked it all in Niels's name. Niels insisted on a half-crop arrangement. Bobby, declining at first, had to yield in the end. Thus the rare thing happened that a pioneer farmer passed from a stage of great necessity, without any transition, to that of comparative affluence. Mrs. Lund, too, was entitled to a substantial remuneration. She had taken care of his stock and yard. She accepted, as a gift duly deeded, an acre of land on Niels's place, to be fenced, with a 3-roomed house fully furnished to be built in the fall. In spite of these arrangements, Niels found that his wealth, in money as well as in chattels, had more than doubled during his absence. Some of his horses, the drivers for instance, Bobby had used and stabled entirely on his place. Some of the cows had been lent to neighbors, so they could milk them in return for their feed. These things settled, Niels went at the work of seeding his field, and now for the first time he faced the day alone. It was not an easy task. To drown one's thought in labor is very difficult on the farm. Everything is conducive to contemplation. No high ambitions lead you away from the present, and yet those ambitions which are indispensable, the lowly ones, are really the highest on earth. The desire for peace and harmony in yourself, your surroundings. But there were no surroundings. There was no little world, no microcosm revolving within the macrocosm. There was the duty to the farm, the country, the world. Cold, abstract things, devoid of the living blood. There was still another difficulty. Since life could be borne only if the immediate past, the last 10 years, were covered with a half-artificial oblivion, the past to be faced in memory was the past of his dreams. It was almost as painful to face as the later one. So long as Niels had to avert his eye from old desires, visions, dreams, there was no foundation for his life. One day Mrs. Lund brought the topic of certain furniture up. She had insisted on doing the milking in return for what little cream and eggs she needed daily. She was going from the cow lot to the house, carrying 2 foaming pails, and stopped in the middle of the yard. "Mr. Lindstedt," she said, "what are you going to do about that furniture from the house?" Niels winced and stopped in his tracks. He had just come in from the field and was watering his horses. Where is it?" he asked at last. "It's all piled in a little shanty in the bluff over there," she said, pointing east. "Bobby and his wife put it up between them. It's a mere windbreak. The rain can get in. The stuff will spoil there. After all, it's worth money." "I'll see," Niels said slowly. Who suggested taking it out of the house?" For the mere fact that Mrs. Lund mentioned the thing proved that it had not been she. Mrs. Lund laughed. "Oh," she said, "that was an idea of Ellen Amundsen's, the last time she was over." Niels said no more. Next day he went into the bush and searched till he found the shanty, well hidden in willows, and, piling some brush against the wall, he set fire to it, without ever looking inside. Ellen. Henceforth, while he was doing his work, not now with that passionate intensity of former years, but slowly, carefully weighing his every move, his thought reverted more and more often to her. She had been over here. She had made suggestions. She had thought of him while he was away. 10 years or longer ago he had left her alone. His life, her life, 2 vessels which he had shattered at a single blow. As for his life, there was only one thing left which he could do: gather the shattered fragments and fit them as best he might be able to do. The nightmare of 10 years he had atoned for, perhaps, but there, in that remoter past, which in his thoughts now became more vivid, more real than the years immediately preceding the present, he had done a great wrong. He had left alone a human being that had been in need of him, had left her alone because he had thought he could never be as little to her as a brother. And that human being had been she, the woman of his dreams, his vision, his love. When the huge steel gate of the prison on the brow of the hill had swung shut behind him, not many days ago, he had felt inwardly balanced, he had felt at peace. Scar tissue had grown over his soul. It had been the peace of resignation, but it had been peace. He felt himself plunged back into unrest, chaos. Once more he was a stranger on his place. He was eating the bitter bread of exile. There would never be any rest for him unless the girl in the bush forgave him. He must try to be to her now what she had wanted him to be to her then, a brother. Was he able to do so? Were all those things that had once disturbed him and her, were they dead in him? Could he face her quietly, without desire, even though she might not hold it against him that he had left her for 10 years or more? He tried to visualize a meeting. It never occurred to him to take into account the fact that they were both more than 10 years older than they had been. Himself, like all people to whom vanity is constitutionally foreign, he did not see. He was he, the one who saw, not the one who was being seen. Ellen, as he tried to see her with his mind's eye, he saw her as she had been, not 10 years ago, but 17. Yet not like that altogether either. Her body, her movements, he could not bring into clear focus at all. Sometimes he had a glimpse of them, a blurred glimpse, through vapors and seething mists of passion, but a glimpse, nevertheless, as she had stood with him in that room of her house where she had told him her story. And whenever he caught that glimpse, even today, his heart beat faster. He reached for that vision as if he wished to hold it, to grasp it with all the tentacles of his mind. But the very next moment he realized that it had eluded him. It had vanished like a spirit into the air. Her face, on the other hand, her expression, he saw very clearly, just as he had seen them on the very first morning when he and Nelson had arrived on her father's place. There it was, her eyes light blue, her features round, her complexion a pure Scandinavian white. Again it was her expression that held him. Hers was the face of a woman, not of a girl. There was a great ripe maturity in it, and a look as if she saw through pretenses and shams, and knew more of life than her age would warrant. No smile lighted her features. Her eyes were stern and nearly condemnatory. But somehow, as Niels looked at her, with his mind's eye only this time, A great desire came over him to see her in the flesh and to make her smile. His throat tightened, his heart pounded as of old. To think he had lost her, not as a mate, what did that matter? Had lost her as a guiding influence in his life, had lost her as a sister, a friend. He had gone astray, had left her alone. Would she want him to come back? Would she accept him now? Would she forgive him? Yet she had been here, had been thinking of him in his absence. For a week he pondered the question, musing, probing himself, probing her. Then, one day, late in the evening, when he had just finished the last round with his cedar, and as he stood ready to bend down and to unhook the traces of his horses, he had a vision. He closed his eyes and stood still to see it more clearly. The vision he saw was that of the homely face of his mother. Yet her features were strangely blurred, as if superimposed on them there appeared those of another. And at last he recognized these as the features of the old man, of Sigurdsson, his neighbor whom he had loved. Long, long ago, in another such vision, his mother had looked at him reproachfully, seriously, warningly, and the old man, in the wanderings of his decaying mind, had betrayed to him some corner of his subliminal memories. These two, in vision and memory, seemed to blend, to melt together. Both looked at him in this new vision out of one face, in which now his, now her lines gained the ascendancy. The wistful face of his mother relaxed in a knowing smile. Yes, such was she who had borne him. The old man's face took her place. He was moving his lips and muttered, cha. One Sunday at last he went north, afoot. It was a warm spring day, the leaves on the trees still dormant, tassels hanging from the aspens, gray and red. Slowly he crossed the corner of the marsh. This was the only trail that was left as it had been years ago. For a while he stood on the bridge, a new concrete bridge which had taken the place of the old wooden structure. A mile from the creek he passed a large clearing to the right, Kelm's place, which he had helped to clear. A huge barn with a hip roof glanced over the trees. A small, well-built frame house nestled in a bluff. Farther on, another farmstead to the left, quite new, a square clearing, bare with the house in the center, the other buildings of logs. Then bush as of old. Once, Niels reflected, the settlement of the Marsh had been an outpost of the settlement in the bush. That was now reversed. The settlement on the Marsh was so much denser. All seemed unchanged. He came to the corner of Ellen's yard. As soon as the view opened up, he stopped and stood. Yes, it was the old place entirely. House, granary, stable, implement shed. One single change, the well which he and Nelson had dug had a pump, and the pump was connected up with a windmill. All about reared the bush. Even that small change spoke of years that had run down the river of time. For a long while Niels stood and waited, trying to calm the turmoil in his heart. He came like the prodigal son. At last he went on. He came to the gate, opened it, and entered the yard, which was still covered by the short, clean sward of chickweed. A dog sprang out of the barn, barked and ran back, out again and in once more. It was a young dog, a bitch, and when Niels could look into the open door of the stable, her strange fierce behavior was explained. A litter of pups played there in the driveway. He knocked at the door of the house. A voice. "Come in," Ellen's voice. He opened, entered, stood. Their eyes met. Niels lowered his. What he had seen shook him like an invisible hand. It hit him like a hammer blow at his heart. He could not bear it. He stood like one accused, like one pleading guilty. What he had seen was this. Behind the table, the same table at which 17 years ago, one winter morning, he had eaten his breakfast, on a straight-backed chair sat a middle-aged woman, knitting, with shell-rimmed glasses on her eyes. Her features were no longer round, they were square, but her complexion was still that pure Scandinavian white. Her hair, straw yellow, streaked with grey. But now, as then, it was the expression that held him. Hers was the face of a girl, not a woman. It was stern, to be sure, but in this sternness lay hidden the dream, the unfulfilled, uncompromising dream of a virgin child. No smile lighted her features. Her eyes looked searchingly out from behind her glasses, searchingly, questioningly, expectantly. There was nothing in them that seemed to condemn. They seemed to wonder, and, what was hardest to bear, they were full of sympathy. Then her voice, clear, high-pitched, not quite steady. "You have come," as if awed. She had risen. Without looking, Niels was aware of her figure, a somewhat flat bust, wide round hips. When he did look, she had removed her glasses. Her eyes, light blue, were fixed on him, probingly, with infinite pity. "Yes," he said, falteringly, "I have come as a brother." She came forward, leaving her work on the table, and moved a chair. "I've been waiting," she said, her voice still unsteady. "I've been waiting, Niels. I've waited 12 years. At that, Niels broke down. He sat on the chair she had touched, his head bent, fighting for composure. And after several minutes, "Ellen, I know," she said, and nodded. "No need to tell me. You've suffered." Silence. He sat, she stood very near. "Shall we go?" she said at last, steadier now. "Behind the house where we used to sit?" Niels rose, took a chair, and turned to the door. She picked her knitting up, adjusted her glasses, and followed. When they arrived in the little natural bower formed by hazel brush and plum trees, he squatted down on the grass as he had done one day in haying time, 10-12 years ago. All about reared the bush. Tremulous stood the aspens, their buds just breaking, tasseled in grey and red. The plum trees, too, had the white buds of their blossoms just bursting. The air was spring cool. They sat in silence a long, long while. Once Niels tried to speak. His first attempt failed. His voice was hoarse, husky. It sounded so strange. He tried again. "Ellen," he said, "can you forgive?" She looked up. He went silent. "You came," she said softly. "No need to speak." And so they sat on, now and then scanning each other, sometimes furtively, sometimes openly. They were feeling their way into a changed present. What they found in each other was the past. They sat for hours, till, under the westering sun, the air became chilly. Ellen spoke. "Come," she said, "let's go to the house. I'll get supper." And once more Niels sat silent in the corner of the room, this time behind the table, in the shadow of the wall. That shadow, too, was the shadow of the past. Happiness, almost ancient, and a sense of infinite sorrow, which was new, were mixed in the mute abandonment to his feelings in which he sat there. The sorrow was at the lapse of time, the old never-ending sorrow that what was is no more. The happiness at the bridging of the gulf of years, accomplished without words, without explanations. As Ellen moved about laying the cloth, heating water, breaking eggs, doing the small trivial things of life in the dusk, not with her former quick grace any longer, but with a pensive, quiet deliberation, his memory reawoke. He saw her again as she had been in the years of their intimacy, their brotherhood. She was she, after all, the only woman. He lulled his heart with a dream that was new, the dream of the restful perpetuation of this state of dusk, of mutual wordless comprehension, of dispassionate friendship, brotherly love. The evening passed. Not many words were interchanged. Words were not needed. Then, in the still early night, they went to the gate. There, separated from each other by the fence, they stood for a moment. Ellen spoke. "Nils, I've waited for you. I knew you would come. Life will be bearable after this. It has been bearable the last 10 years only through expectation. I want to say one more thing, Nils. I have been to blame towards you. Can you forgive?" Nils threw his hands up, a vague gesture to silence her. Don't. If you speak that way, I can't bear it. The wrong that was done was all on my side. I have repented." "Not all," Ellen said, her voice shaking. "Not chiefly, even." And after a short silence, she added, "You will come again?" Nils nodded silently, unseen, but in a chance motion his hand touched hers, and they knew. Once more during the week, Nils tried to drown his dreams in work. Once more he did what he had done many years ago. He worked passionately, as if his very existence depended on doing more than he could. The smaller trees in the bluff blossomed forth, clouds of white blossoms. The leaves were hanging from the poplar twigs, weak, as if tired, young, helpless. Before them the whole of summer lay, the summer of life. In Nils's heart there was a strange struggle, a readjustment of many thoughts, feelings, anticipations. It was a painful process, as if the parts of a broken limb were being fitted together, slowly, tentatively, by a skilled but callous physician who did not seem to succeed. It was as if some part were missing, or rather as if a superfluous part were there, preventing the perfect joint. And that superfluous part which prevented the past and the future from fitting together was a strange new hope, a hope which it was almost painful to feel and altogether forbidden to face. It was a mere adumbration of the thought of a possible outcome, a mere foreshadowing of a state of things that might come about, like a miracle hardly to be visualized. It was at once suppressed with a beating of the heart, a scarlet flooding of the brain. To face it seemed equivalent to precluding it. It was such a tender, delicate thing of a hope. Nils felt like a convalescent who has for many weeks and months been forbidden to move, and who, tentatively, first stirs a finger and then a hand, furtively, almost ashamed of the realization of powers in him returning, reawaking. He felt as if he must hold still so as not to frighten away what was preparing in him, a new health, a new strength, a new hope, a new life. He saw the week going by, sometimes impatiently, sometimes in fear, always with pulse beating faster, with heart aflutter, articulate thought blurred out, eye clouded. And yet he said to himself, once, twice, a dozen times, I am her brother. Nothing must interfere. I am her brother and nothing else. The days went by, the marvel of passing time. Another Sunday, with white clouds sailing, a Sunday in June. Ellen stands at the gate, looking along the road which is still no more than a bush trail. They look at each other as they meet, and they blush. Ellen swings the little gate open and turns. He follows. Both know, and each knows that the other knows. A new strange thing has happened between them. Expectancy is in their eyes, emotion. They see that coming which makes their hearts beat, that which is like a memory of old times long past. But it is not with fear that their pulse is quickened. It is with an anticipation which neither of them is unwilling to prolong. For behind that anticipation there stands a certainty. Again, as they cross the yard in silence, going to the accustomed place, that natural bower in the fringe of the bush, imponderable things, incomprehensible waves of feeling pass to and fro between them, things too delicate for words, things somehow full of joy and disquieting, though not unpleasurable, expectation. Spring breezes amble through the bush, a meadowlark sings on the nearby clearing, robins chase each other in the grass. And as the silence lengthens between them, between man and woman, the consciousness arises in each that the other knows his inmost thought, that both have secretly, almost reluctantly, faced the same hope. Color comes and goes in their faces, imperceptible almost, not seen by either, for they avoid each other's eyes, yet divined. And as they stand there, by the chairs which the woman has provided, a memory rises, flushing her face with a scarlet flood. She speaks as if she would ward it off. She speaks hurriedly, like a girl, precipitately, and her words are the same as they were 10-12 years ago. "Shall we sit here?" she says. "Let us have a walk, rather, shall we?" Niels nods. Her words are expression of his thought, or his desire unformed. He does not think in articulate terms. "The bush hides," she says. "It shelters, protects. It has served me well. But sometimes I wish I had a vista through it, out on the plains, to the horizon. I want to see wide open, level spaces. Let's go to the slough." Again Niels nods. He does not trust himself to speak. His voice would seem so strange, it would break a spell. There is no barrier between them which would need to be bridged by words. They are not looking at each other, they are one. "Wait," says the girl. "I'll get my hat." And she slips past him into the house. He idles back to the yard. The blood sings in his veins. He stands strangely aglow. Light green, virgin, the bush rears all about. Aspen leaves shiver, reflecting little points of light from their still glossy surface. "I love spring," says the girl as she rejoins him, her hat slung by its ribbons over her arm. She was still speaking to ward the coming moment off, saying anything that came to hand at random. "I wish it were always spring." They pass through the gate and onto the bush road, turning north, side by side. Again, between them, the tension grows less. What has happened between them is a beginning, it is not the end. What must come will come. There is much to follow. Why tremble? Why hasten it? To be merely alive is joy enough. First they follow the bush road, then they leave it, threading a cattle path that branches off to the left where the road bends eastward. Birds flutter up as they touch the bushes. They flit away, looking curiously at the intruding pair. The cattle path forks. The girl follows one branch, the man another. They do not flit and run. They go quietly, sedately. Still they avoid each other's eye, but each knows that the other is flushed, that his face smiles with a strange, almost otherworldly smile. Whoever arrives first at the rejunction of the trails waits for the other. The other is coming. Thus they reach the little school and look about. The yard is cleared. No brambles cover it any longer. Around the building the ground is bare, vegetation being worn down by many feet. They stand and look, their feelings half joy, half sorrow. They go to the windows of the schoolhouse and peer in. They do not laugh, but they smile at sight of benches and blackboards. Then they go on, quietly, reminiscently. No need for words. Between them there stands the past, not as a barrier now, as a bond. These two have been parted, and parting has opened their eyes. They have suffered. Suffering has made them sweet, not made them bitter. Life has involved them in guilt. Regret and repentance have led them together. They know that never again must they part. It is not passion that will unite them. What will unite them is love. They are older, both feel it, older than they were when they threaded these thickets before. They are quieter, less apt to rush at conclusions, to close in a struggle with life. They come out to the slough and see the horizon, far in the north. They stand and look. Both think of a haystack that stood in the meadow a few hundred yards in front. There is no haystack there now. It is spring, not autumn. "Shall we sit?" says the girl. They find a place in the grass with a fallen tree for a backrest. They sit and look out as if in a resurrection of what was dead. The man has turned. He was conscious of something in the girl by his side, of something disturbing, or perhaps disturbed. He looks at her face, which is held straight ahead, almost rigid. Something works in her features, and between the lashes of her light blue eyes, white, sun-bleached lashes, there quivers a tear. "Ellen," he says, his voice a tremble. "Niels," she replies, "it is time we make up for what we have done in the past. I have something to say to you, Niels. I should have thought of it 12 years ago, but I did not know it then. Yet I knew it the moment you had left my yard. Only I did not trust my own knowledge. Niels, I too am a woman. I too need more than mere brotherhood. The years go by, we both are passing through life. There is nothing that will remain when we are gone." "Ellen," he says again, and presses her small, shapely, calloused hand in his own large one. "I know," she says. "Don't speak. I have more to say. I have been to blame. I should not have said at the time, 'What you wish can never be.' I should have said, 'What you wish cannot be so long as I live under the shadow of my mother's life. But if you can wait—' For, Niels, I knew then, as I know now, that it is my destiny and my greatest need to have children. And I knew then, as I know now, that there is no man living on earth from whom I would accept them, if not you. I thought I could live my life as a protest against the life my mother had lived. I had loved her, and she was dead. I should have known. Had she been living, the mistake would never have been made. Again the man by her side presses her hand. Their shoulders touch, not with the fleeting touch, as in the bush. They are leaning against each other, quietly, trustingly, in peace with the world. The man speaks, slowly, softly, his head bent low. Do you think we can live down what lies in between? Niels, she says, I've had more than 6 years' time to think that over. I believe we can, and whether we can or not, we must try. An hour or so later they rise and walk home through the dusk. They do not kiss, their lips have not touched, but their arms rest in each other's, their fingers are intertwined. As they go, a vision arises between them, shared by both. End of section 20. End of Settlers of the Marsh by Frederick Philip Grove.